It's Big Tone MMA back with Nolan Kings of MMA Today.
Brutal.
uh,
That's the only reason you wanted to host again, right?
I kind I
Just
kind of
leave
wanted
it
to
at
sneak it
that.
in
You
there.
wanted to win the S battle.
I mean, did you? I mean, we could talk about your gross Nick Newell joke that you sent me to get me on this podcast.
Oh, you bastard. I didn't send you any joke.
Well,
You misconstrued what I was saying.
it came off as kind of, yeah, like let's cut the show in half.
I think that like thought is more on you than it is.
Is it really?
It's way more on you.
Let's cut the show in half this time.
Brutal.
Uh, anyway, outside of bashing people with disabilities, we had pretty killer Contender Series night, right? I mean,
Oh yeah, it's great.
decent card.
Yeah, absolutely.
I feel like a lot of people just wanted to tune in for the main event, but if you did, you missed out on quite a few good fights and probably watched the worst fight of the night. So shame on you. But let's get into it. I mean, it kicked off with two very, very young kids. One of them looked like he couldn't have been more than 16 years old, and Chase Hooper facing, I'll let you pronounce that Hawaiian name.
Kanan Kawahe.
Kawahe.
Yeah, Kawahe.
Yeah, Kawahe, like Kauai. This was a featherweight fight. Chase Hooper is 18. Somehow had already racked up 5 wins. Had been training since he was 8 years old, I believe. Is that correct?
Yeah, since he was 8, he's been training for 10 years. Pretty well-spoken kid for 18 years old. A pretty smart kid too. He graduated high school a year early, just focusing on MMA. He didn't really, want to pursue any type of college or other careers. Grew up poor, didn't really have that even in his plans, and he started fighting professionally in October. He's gone 6-0 in the first 10 months of being a pro. I believe 10 months. Nope, 8 months of being a pro.
Yeah.
9 months of being a pro. 9 months of being a pro. So not too shabby there. And yeah, so both fighters were a little green in my opinion. I don't know if you agree with me.
Super green. I mean, the fact, I don't think I've ever, I mean, we both watch regional MMA and whatnot, but man, like Chase's body just needs time to really fill out. Like I don't even think he's hit puberty yet, basically. So
yeah, that was the one thing, like, I think was really alarming to me at the beginning. Obviously, he was kind of getting manhandled by Kenan Kawai, who was, another guy that's not necessarily huge by any means, but he just seemed like really outmatched in the strength department.
Yeah, if you were to have them stand next to each other, right? And this is just like, human, biology. I mean, when you get older, your body starts to fill out. You get more muscular and whatnot. And like at 20 years old, the Kauai is just so much more filled out, and Chase very little muscle. Like, just kind of like if you watch the NBA, and just guys come out of college or like their 1 year of college, and it's like that guy really needs to put on some muscle, like Brandon Ingram, or like who's another really skinny guy, they kind of look like Wiz Khalifa.
Yeah. That's a good comparison.
Chase Hooper is like in that boat where it's just like you need to put on some muscle, like bad.
Yeah. He competed a little bit at 155. I don't know if like he'd be a little bit less lanky there, adding on 10 pounds. I don't know how much of a difference it would make, but I think what's that?
You want him to move up.
I don't know. What are you going to do with him? I mean, he's got to put. I think for me, he's got to either grow into a man's body or put on some muscle. I just think he wasn't very strong. He's kind of like a stick figure, So it's that balance, because on one hand he's going to be facing stronger guys, at the same time like he's going to be able to put on more muscle. So I don't know. It's an interesting an interesting debate there. And I guess, my guess with him, obviously the development deal, I think most of these guys, we're going to not end up seeing them in the UFC or close to the UFC until next year's Contender Series. I'm just guessing that that's, after judging what they did with Bevon Lewis last year, I'm guessing that will probably be the route that they go. Greg Hardy being an exception, of course. But that's what I'm kind of thinking here.
Well, like, let's talk about the actual fight. So Chase Hooper is getting lit up in the first round, clearly outmatched on the feet, and I think Kawhi gasses himself out
big time.
Big time. Second round comes along, and now it's Chase Hooper's turn. I mean, he's ground and pounding, looking for multiple submissions, looking like he's going to get the finish. And then it's basically the same thing in the same story in the third round. I mean, it's Chase Hooper. Like, probably if he had a little bit better fight IQ, a little bit more experience, would have just kept throwing. You know, not that they're necessarily doing damage, but he just kept throwing. When you just keep throwing ground and pound strikes, and the ref just like has to, you like force the ref to step in. Kind of one of those situations. Like, he probably could have done that at some point because he had the mount. Full mount and everything. Clearly, Chase Hooper's fight was one of those weird ones where every round was probably a 10-8, at least in my books. So you had a 10-8 round for Kawhi in the first round, and then the last were 10-8s for Hooper. So it came out to this weird 28-26 decision, which one judge I thought got right. The other two had a 29-26. And I called it right away. I said, this kid's getting a developmental contract.
Yeah. I mean, that makes so much sense. I mean, with him, again, like, my biggest fear with prospects, I say it over and over again like a broken record, is that they rush people. It's just not necessary to throw these young kids in there, and just rush them up the ladder because you see that they could be something great eventually. Like Sage Northcutt, I know I bring up the example all the time, Paige Van Zandt, like, they just felt the need to bring these fighters on board when maybe another fight or two outside of the promotion could really benefit them. So hopefully, this developmental league will be a good middle ground where the UFC can keep their leash on these guys, but at the same time, these fighters don't have to go in and even face the bottom tier level UFC guys, because those, for a prospect that's still green and shown a lot of promise, like, to even go in and fight the guys in the bottom 30% of the UFC, like, there's a lot of tough fights there, a lot of fights that could end up spoiling their momentum, spoiling their confidence. So I just don't see the necessity for urgency in some of these cases.
Yeah, definitely. I totally agree with you. I think there's a lot of promise with both these guys. Obviously, Chase, with the being much younger, kind of this prodigy-like figure, has I would probably say more upside at this point. So, and got the win. So, props to him. And it went from very young featherweights to older to heavyweights, and one of them being like 35, I think. Quite the contrast here.
Yeah, it was funny on my timeline. I'm overly positive, and I understand that. It's just kind of the way that I like to be. But my overly negative Twitter, I think I'm trying to offset all the overly negative people on Twitter. And, like, I went from complaining about people being too young and too, scrawny, to having people complain about people being too old and too out of shape, or whatever people were saying about, it's just, you can't please everybody, I guess. But yeah, I mean, the next fight was between two heavyweights that were, seasoned veterans in their own rights. And I'll let you take it from here. What happened?
So they called Jeff Hughes, lived up to his neck, lights out. I mean, he just basically manhandled Josh and landed some nasty blows from the clinch. The one that finished it off was actually more of a glancing blow, but if you've ever had your nose broken, it hurts really fucking bad. I know, like, the UFC fighters, when they get their nose broken in a fight, will act like nothing happened. But
as someone who hasn't got their nose broken, I have to say, just in my head, when I first saw that punch, I was like, oh, like, that was kind of weird. Something must have happened. When I saw the replay, like, the idea that it could glance his nose and not hit his face, you know, it wasn't the hardest punch to his face. It was just a really hard punch that clipped his nose. Like, I think that almost seems more painful to me. Like that your nose could be pointed up in this direction. Like, damn, you know, like, oh. And Apel's a tough guy. He's only been knocked out twice, I think, and you know that clearly was you can't fault him there for covering up on that one.
Yeah, and with Jeff Hughes, you know, he showed off that power. He's in a division that needs help. We always talk about this heavyweight, those preferential treatment. He's training at the same gym as Stipe. So, you know, there's a lot of stuff going for him. He's had, you know, quite a few, at least a few LFA fights.
Yeah.
So it's someone that, you know, kind of a proven product, I guess you could say. He was the LFA heavyweight champion, so it's a proven product.
Yeah, absolutely.
It used to be like the LFA champions would just automatically go to the UFC anyway, you know, right? So now it's more like just one more hurdle for them to pass.
Yep.
And Jeff Hughes passed it with flying colors, so
yeah,
he'll be right in the UFC heavyweight division now,
which is perfect. Yeah, I mean, if you look at it, I'm kind of glad at the reception that he got, because I wasn't really sure what people would think if they, you know, this was the performance I was expecting from Jeff Hughes, and knowing that he would probably put on a performance like this, I was a little concerned that people wouldn't be as receptive to it, because it's not let's just face it, it's not the most sexy, you know, spinning back kick like knockout or something that we see sometimes on Contender Series, flying knees, head kicks, or, you know, Sadiq Youssef, Mike Davis, that type of fight that we're going to talk about later on. At the same time, I think you got to realize that even though he sometimes can seem a little bit, you know, grueling and a little, I don't want to say sloppy is not the right word, but just kind of, you know, up in your grill, pushing against the fence, dirty boxing, things like that, that I was afraid that people wouldn't necessarily recognize how good he actually is, because, you know, he's fought top competition for LFA and, you know, obviously here in Contender Series, and nobody's been able to really to stop him in any way. I mean, he's dealt with very little problems, at least in his last couple of fights. So, you know, outside of a couple of Canadian heavyweights and Don'Tale Mayes, who's fighting next week on the Contender Series, I mean, you got to throw Jeff Hughes like as top 4, maybe heavyweight North America right now. So no dispute in my mind that he should have got the contract. He's earned it before this, in my opinion, and now he just reaffirmed it. So I'm really happy with the way that you know, that went down.
Well, we got a good question already from a viewer related to this from Eduardo Flores. Asks, how do you think Jeff Hughes does in the heavyweight division, and who do you think should be his first fight?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think he'll do well. I think he's better than some of the bottom tier heavyweights. I think he's better than, you know, say I think sometimes when they go to, especially when they go to international locations, I think that they pick up sometimes, you know, some local heavyweights. We have a couple Asian heavyweights, a couple, you know, Russian heavyweights that I think, you know, that Hughes could definitely beat. You know, for his first fight, maybe throw him against a guy like Alan Crowder, who was on Contender Series last year, lost his debut, or like a Nazuna and Yanwu, who also was on Contender Series and lost his debut. Somebody like that, maybe like a 1-0 or an 0-1 or 1-1 heavyweight. I know he was talking about the top 10 and things like that, but I wouldn't throw him at somebody in the rankings yet. You know, I'm not a fan of that. Like, we'll talk about Kevin Holland later on and that whole situation, but I'm just not. There's very few instances I think anybody does not have a fight or has not had a fight in the UFC should get a ranked fighter like that. That's just not something that I see as something that should happen.
Definitely. No, you're right. And I agree with you. You called this one. You said this was probably, I don't know the exact words you used, but you said this is the fight you were most looking forward to, or basically hyping this one up, the Sadiq Youssef and Mike Davis fight. And it delivered. I don't know. You always call these for some reason. You has there been one where you said that you hyped it up and it turned out to be terrible?
No, I mean, I've hyped up some fighters maybe that have turned out to not put on great performances or lose or stuff. But, you know, overall, I think I've been, if I do say so myself, I think I've been pretty good at it. And this was no exception here. I think phenomenal fight. I think what this one had that maybe some of the other ones on Contender Series that have been exciting didn't have was the fact that not only was it a wild slugfest, it was a controlled wild slugfest, if that makes sense. Like, These guys were throwing haymakers. They had sequences where they were both exchanging, but there was a lot of head movement involved, a lot of footwork involved, a lot of cutting the cage off involved, and the guys knew when to take a step back and not get out of control. And I think this was, I saw somebody on, I think it was actually Sadiq Youssef's manager said this on Twitter that Brian Hamper from Sucker Punch, I believe that's who he's with, said that if Mike Davis fought, I think what he said was any of the other featherweights on the season, I don't know if I'd have to think about who else is on the season, but if he fought, most of these other, in most of these other fights against different opponents, that he probably would have ended up with a contract. And that's true. I think like this fight and then the Austin Tweedy versus T. Edwards fight we saw a few weeks ago, on paper, these two fights were like rarities in terms of how good the matchmaking was and how high the level was for this Contender Series. I mean, it wasn't like sometimes I feel like we have, Jeff Hughes, awesome heavyweight, Josh Apelt, solid underdog guy that's kind of earned it. We've had a few of those type of matchups on this Contender Series, but this one was like a coin toss, top guys that could be in the UFC already going at it.
I like the coin toss because Youssef was actually the 2-1 underdog.
In my book, in the Nolan King sports betting, it was even.
Oh, you're doing all your own sport. I forgot that they legalized gambling out there on the East Coast.
Yes.
So my bad. But Sadiq Youssef was a 2-1 underdog. Came out with some nasty leg kicks. I thought we were going to see a leg kick TKO at one point. Was definitely looking to land that bomb over right hand. He's got nasty right hand, man. And the punch that actually scored the knockdown in the first or second round was a check lift hook, which is essential for anybody that trains Muay Thai. Or I guess I shouldn't say Muay Thai because Muay Thai is the only thing I've trained. But I'm sure if you train boxing, they would probably teach you this as well. The check hook is like the ultimate. I don't know. It's the ultimate weapon to stop someone from advancing, like an ultra aggressive opponent, someone like Mike Davis, who was really looking to get in the grill of Youssef. And really got paid the price for that. I mean, he was getting eaten up with leg kicks, and that right hand, he just kept timing the counter and getting them. And man, Youssef looked really good. Davis had flashes of brilliance too, but in the end, Youssef just proved to be the much superior fighter here.
Yeah.
Imagine if Mike Davis had fought like Chase Hooper, though.
Right, that's what I'm saying. Hopefully they wouldn't have made that fight. I kind of think that first fight was maybe geared towards two beginners and level class. But yeah, Sadiq Youssef looked great. I thought his composure was awesome. You could tell the level of opponents that the two fighters had fought. Just Youssef embodied the fact that he's had to be in there and really be mentally on his game at all times in some of his previous fights. Looking at their two records, both impressive, but clearly Youssef had the more experienced fighters that he had competed against. I just thought he looked great. I loved his composure, loved his footwork, loved his jab, loved his leg kick. So super happy with his performance. He was my #1 pick that I thought should have got a contract tonight by far. And I'm happy to say that I was on the right track.
I'm so glad you brought up the record of his opponents because that is something we talked about on the last show, is it not?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's very important. We have, especially when we're talking prospects, we have guys whose records are just flat out inflated.
Right.
And they're not fighting the best of the best. When you get, when you're fighting someone 1-3 or I don't know. There's weird stuff that goes on in regional MMA.
Yeah,
so good to know what the record of their opponents was. And something I noticed at LFA over the weekend, because I'm not a casual and I watch all MMA of all kinds. Humble brag.
You took the words right out of my mouth.
I was, I was just watching LFA because I'm a hardcore MMA fan on Friday. And they actually, a stat they're not putting up is the record of their opponents. And I thought that was fucking amazing. I'm like, this is genius. Like, especially for a show like LFA where they have so many prospects, it's like they should totally do this. They should, like, as part of the tail of the tape, put like, here's the record of like, his opponents that he's fought before.
Yeah.
I was like, they should always do this. Like,
yeah, my dad's kind of a little bit of a casual fan, and it's always interesting to me because I would say he's not necessarily a casual, but he's not a hardcore either. Like, he watches almost as much MMA as I do. Like, whenever it's on, he'll just be there, like, whatever. Like you were at the, I don't know if you had somebody in your household that watched a lot of, I don't know. I know you're into basketball, so that's not a good example, but he's always there when it's on, and he'll pay attention most of the time and stuff like that. But he always talks about that.
Nolan, there's no sport that you can out me on.
Water polo.
That you have to know more about me than.
Is that English?
No, I'm saying you have to. What is there a sport that you know more about than
hockey?
Hell no.
Hell yeah.
Nah.
I'm like a very big closeted hockey fan.
You're not closeted at all. You're a Bruins fan.
I forgot. We don't
closet like Marchand is, maybe.
No, I forgot that you're. What team do you root for again?
Rangers.
Where do you live again?
California, and I'm a New York Giants fan as well.
Speaking of closeted,
because I'm Italian and my family's from New York, and I also have an Italian football club.
Okay. This is the ContenderCast. This isn't the.
Forget about it.
This isn't the Tony Cast, California Cast. But yeah, I don't even remember where we were going with that. Oh, I was just saying, like, we were talking about the records of the opponents and stuff. I think that's a great tool, especially if for people that maybe don't follow the scene as much.
Well, you were trying to relate that to something I couldn't.
I was talking about how my dad's kind of a casual fan. He always says he doesn't know the fighters a lot of times on LFA.
Got it.
So he'll say, "Oh, that's what he'll go off of," and I think it is a very good tool. There's some exceptions to the rule. I've said this before. Like, just because a guy's beating cans doesn't mean necessarily that he's not a good fighter. I mean, Nasrat Hakparast is a great example. I think I used him last week. Like, again, look at his record on the regional scene, but you can still watch him and say, "Damn, this kid has some serious abilities at 19 years old to be pulling off some of the stuff he's doing." And then he goes to the UFC and he's doing pretty well for himself. So there are some exceptions. You can't go strictly off of it. But I think in terms of if you have two successful guys and one of them has beaten good opponents, like that is just obviously a green light to know get a better gauge of where he's at than somebody that hasn't. That's just simple. I'm not being a rocket scientist on that one.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's not an end all be all for sure. Like you said, I mean, just because they're beating up on lower level guys doesn't mean, that they're not legit. I know at one point, there's plenty of guys. Basically, there's plenty of guys that are either in UFC or Bellator that have at one point been beating up on lesser competition because they're just better than everybody else, and it's hard to find fights for guys that are really good as well. That's a real problem. Is when you're a good fighter, guys don't want to fight you. Not on the regional scene, at least. When you make it to the higher levels, then it becomes, well, I take that back because there are still like Usman, like people like nobody wants to fight Usman. That's a whole other subject. We won't get sidetracked there. But
we do have a couple of questions in the chat again. We should go back to Keith's trying to chirp me.
Do you actually have questions, or is he just being an ass?
No, he's just trying to chirp me. Trying. But yeah, I think Eduardo Flores says, which we appreciate your questions. You have a bunch of them in here. What I like about the season is that Dana has signed prospects in divisions that need fresh blood, light heavyweight and heavyweight. I agree. I think that was something they set out to really do. If you look at the weight classes, I think that the UFC is neglecting flyweight at this point. I don't understand it, men's flyweight. But the women's divisions, women's flyweight, the couple, honestly, there weren't that many women's fights, but if you look at the Brazil version, there's a ton. So they're clearly targeting certain divisions over others. I mean, we had a light heavyweight, which we're going to talk about in a second, and a heavyweight win tonight, and they both got signed. And I don't think that's coincidence. Like, if they were lightweights and had that performance, would they be signed? I don't know. That would be something we'd have to reassess, but definitely that's something that goes into it, is the division that they're in. The other questions about the Russian MMA we can get to at the end. I don't mind answering those at the end, but
let's try to keep it somewhat on topic as well. I mean, we could always have another show where we discuss rumors and whatnot.
Yeah, that'd be cool. That might be a good idea. But yeah, I'll just run through them real quick. Mirabek Taisimov, possible opponent. I honestly have no idea. I like to think that they'll put him in Russia just because
Moscow.
they have no excuse not to at this point, that he doesn't have to travel out of the country. So that would be good. And then according to Team Dagestan MMA, great Twitter account, by the way. It's been way more right than it's been wrong ever. Says it's very possible that Sergey Pavlovich signs with the UFC. What do you think about him? I think he's a good fighter. I've only seen him fight a couple of times. I'd have to do some more extensive tape work on him. But tape work. That almost sounds like tapeworm. But anyways, I'd have to look into him. I think he's a good signing, obviously, in those divisions. Why not? And then last thing, Dennis Goltsov.
I want to stop because Pavlovich isn't just a decent signing. I mean, that's a great signing. I've seen him fight quite a bit in Fight Nights Global, and he's beaten everyone they put in front of him, including guys that were supposed to beat him, like Sedenkov was supposed to beat him and fell flat. So, I mean, that's a tough dude. I know he hasn't fought in a while now. I think we're approaching, 9 months of inactivity or something, but that's also because Fight Nights Global has the whole thing with bad stuff coming to Russian MMA, so we won't get into that.
The last thing, Dennis Goltsov. Only thing I'll say about that, I don't know what's up with him. I can try to find that out. That's something I probably could find out. He was my pick. I think he's a great fighter. He was my pick to win the heavyweight tournament for a PFL, and he had to pull out. So hopefully we'll see him somewhere, whether it be the UFC or wherever. So, all right, back to the drawing, not the drawing board. Moving things in the right direction. I'm running on about 2 hours worth of sleep in the last 48 hours. So my words are all starting to become one.
You're running on a boot 24 hours? Is that what you said?
What's that?
You said you're running on a boot. How many hours?
I've been awake.
You didn't notice?
Yesterday morning, I've been awake all hours except 2 hours that I slept.
I think you just went a little bit Canadian on us, though, because
that was really backwards. Anyways, let's end this before let's move this along before I turn full Canadian.
Jim Crute took on Chris Birchler. Another, these aren't heavyweights, but heavy dudes, light heavyweights. And I think you said before this fight, no offense to Birchler, but Crute should definitely get the win here. I think the odds definitely agreed with you there. There was not really a whole lot to talk about here as far as, it was pretty one-sided, I thought. I don't know if you had,
I honestly was a little bit surprised. Having studied them both, I thought Crute was set up in a position where the UFC really wanted him to win. Birchler, again, I'm not going to discredit, even though the guys that deserve to be on Contender Series the least amount, or people are saying, oh, why did this person end up there? And when there's these prospects, things like that. I think they're all tough guys. Like, there's nobody they brought in that's been a straight bum. Like, that's not something that even would make any sense. So, for Birchler, he lost 2 out of his last 3 fights, one of them being to Matt Hamill. And it was just it was a little bit of an interesting signing to bring him in against a 22-year-old from the only non-North American competitor that they brought onto the Contender Series this season. I think there's a reason for that. He's been training at the Performance Institute, 22 years old, 7-0 as a light heavyweight. So I thought they were setting him up big time to win this. He did get the win. He got it in the first round. He got signed. It's the whole point of the show. At the same time, I did think that Birchler actually I'm talking about Crute, excuse me. I do think
but Crute wasn't the only non-North American fighter on this season, right?
Who's on?
We had another foreigner.
I think you're right too. I'm like blanking on it.
There was somebody that was definitely not from North America.
Because there was a guy from Mexico that had to pull out of the fight. I can go back and look while we're talking, but anyways, he was one of them. They made very few exceptions. There were a couple of Canadians that got offered that didn't end up on the show. I mean, that's still North America, but they wanted him. He's somebody they wanted to bring in for an international draw, and he went out there. And I honestly thought Birchler was piecing him up a little bit. Just one shot, kind of heavy hands, Crute was bleeding. You know, his face was busted up. And the one thing that was weird to me was Crute was landing some solid shots on Birchler, but Birchler, up until the punch that ended it all, didn't really seem to be bothered at all. He was just kind of walking through it. I mean, I kind of had a gift ready to go before he got knocked out of, I think it was from like SpongeBob or something, and somebody goes to punch somebody in the jaw and their hand like breaks. I don't know. That's what I felt like. It was just everything that was getting thrown at Birchler, he was just kind of rolling off him, and then ended up there was one punch he couldn't roll off. So what did you think of the stoppage, man? I know that was a big topic of discussion on the online and stuff. For me, just to give my brief assessment, I don't think it was a usual stoppage, so I kind of had to think about it for a little bit. But I honestly am not. Could it have been let go? Like, would it have been bad if he didn't stop it? No. But am I like that outraged that he did stop it? Nah. I'm kind of on the fence about it, to be honest.
I would say I was definitely in the camp where I thought, you know, if we're gonna let, you know, the previous fights, the way that they went with, you know, I thought at multiple points the Chase Hooper Kawhi fight could have been stopped, and then I think there was even one point in the Yusuf Davis fight where Davis was in serious trouble.
Yep,
I'm thinking of a different one.
No, you're right.
And like,
got hurt a couple times.
If we're not going to stop those, then like, I mean, the guy is not out. He's standing there, and as the ref is waving it off, he's asking him why he's waving it off.
Yeah,
that's a delayed reaction. Like the ref is waving it off, and the fighter is like, "Wait, what?"
Right.
I
think the problem that I have is like, if because again, I was I'm still kind of on the fence. I'll probably be on the fence about it forever, but. For me, like, if you start stopping fights at the moment that anybody looks hurt because they look hurt, that's going to set a bad precedent. I know he did look away for a second. He kind of was like really wiggle legs, you know, rubber legs, spaghetti legs, whatever you want to call them. And but he did recover. And by the time that the referee got to him, which was before obviously Crute got to him, Birchler was kind of back into it. So I see the argument on both sides, but I think I might have, if I was the referee, I probably would have let it go on a little longer, but I'm also usually erring on the side of violence, so I'm not sure.
Yes, definitely a capital V with the violence, but like I saw some people comparing this to the Shogun fight and saying he was out on his feet. I think that's a little absurd. He wasn't clearly not out on his feet as he was talking to the ref like milliseconds after this you know, getting hit. So he's clearly not out on his feet, and comparing that to the Shogun fight is a tad ridiculous, as Shogun was brutally knocked out. I mean, he was clearly knocked out. Like, there was no question about it. The fence was the only thing keeping him up, you know? Like, he basically dropped down to his ass as soon as the fight was called.
I completely agree with you there, man.
The situations are not comparable. Let's not get overboard with the you know, hyperbole and whatnot. Anyway, on to the main event. This is what everybody came to see. I even had casual MMA fans asking me, when is the next Newell fight? Like, you know, when's the main event? And I'm like, with the Contender Series, you just never know, because there could be 4 straight stoppages, you know, and it could be to the main event already. So I didn't really want to give anybody a time. But honestly, like I said at the beginning of the show, I mean, if you just tuned in just for the Alex Munoz Nick Newell fight, I mean, he missed out on a lot of good action, and he probably got the worst fight of the night. So bad choice. Anyway, Munoz, you know, he's actually as far as I know, the wrestling coach out at Team Alpha Male.
At least one of them.
Well, they got multiple. Yeah. I should clarify. He's not the wrestling coach. He's one of the wrestling coaches. You know, not exactly high profile guy. Has been taking some fights and has taken some fights in lower level promotions like XKO. Definitely not, you know, one of the higher caliber guys to throw at Nick Newell. But it was an interesting. We had talked about this leading up to this. This was a very interesting matchup. with Munoz being so wrestling oriented. He had also been sidelined. I think he hadn't fought in like 2 years or something like that. So that was also an odd choice to bring him. Not like he was retired, but to bring him back from a long layoff to fight Nick. So it kind of felt like they were giving Nick every chance to win this fight. And then you also have the argument that, they matched him up with the wrestler so he wouldn't get knocked out. And then, because I actually brought this up to Dana at the UFC 225 post-fight press conference, was, the risk-reward factor with Nick is, if he wins, it's such a great story. If he gets knocked out, you're going to be getting killed by people who are going to be seeing this highlight out of context of him getting KO'd. I didn't say these exact words, basically, but I'm elaborating. This highlight reel will circulate of him getting KO'd, and you're like, well, he doesn't have a left hand to protect himself, to guard himself. That turned out to be true in some ways because Nick couldn't catch the kicks coming from the right side of Munoz, which started early, and started eating up that lead leg of Nick. So that became a problem that I hadn't even thought about, was the fact that he couldn't catch leg kicks and then in turn counter those and grab, and get a takedown or do what you will with those, land a punch or whatever. So that was an interesting point that I hadn't even thought of. Overall, Munoz got taken down. Munoz got multiple takedowns, largely dominated this fight. I didn't think there was any question about, who. I think Nick's nose got broken at one point, got busted up pretty bad, got taken down, and just overall was not his night. I mean, it was pretty rough. I don't know what your expectations were coming in. What were your expectations coming in, and what did you leave this fight thinking?
Yeah, my expectations coming in, I wasn't necessarily sure. Can you hear that?
What did you say?
There was like a big echo going on.
Oh, go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, it's much better now. But there wasn't necessarily my expectations coming in. I didn't really necessarily know what to think because there was an unknown. Alex Munoz, we didn't really know what he brought to the table. We knew he was a little bit of a wrestler. We knew, he's trained as an alpha male. But besides that, we didn't really know much about him. So for me, what I ended up looking on paper was I saw a guy that in Nick Newell, who a lot of people are running a narrative that they think the UFC was trying to prevent Nick Newell from getting to the UFC or whatever. I kind of think the opposite. I think they would have loved to have a guy, that is such an amazing story that brings eyeballs to the sport, brings, obviously with eyeballs you get money, popular guy that would be a good representative of mixed martial arts. To bring him in, I think the UFC would actually be really happy with that. So in my mind, I'm thinking, okay, he's headlining. They've made a big deal about it. They're giving him a 4-0 guy who hasn't fought in 20 months, who there's no tape on. Like, I thought Nick was going to win. I just thought, but it was more of the unknown of Munoz. And the things that we learned from Munoz, there was a lot that we learned about him in this fight. I think he's a really smart fighter. I don't know if it was him or his camp, but I thought his game plan was great. He was very composed, never really let Newell get his game going, and it paid off, man. He got the win. He got a dominant win on a big stage in a tough position in your 5th pro fight against a guy that's 14-1 who is renowned. So I think it was a big W for him, even though he didn't get awarded a contract. He's the only one that didn't get anything on the show. At the same time, I think he's somebody that the UFC will definitely keep in mind because I was really impressed with that performance. If I had seen that in LFA, if I had seen that in World Series of Fighting or PFL, that would have been a solid performance that would have got me to think that guy's pretty good. And let me just say one more thing, Tony, because this has been something I said on like over and over and over again beforehand, and I think that it still applies now. There's no difference in my mind, which was that when the argument was being made that Nick Newell was a shoo-in for the UFC, this is a travesty that he's not signed, all these things. I'm a huge supporter of what Nick does. I think he's an inspiration. I think he is somebody that, kids, no matter what they're going through in life, whether they might have some health problems or have a disability or just be a normal kid struggling with whatever, they can kind of look to him for inspiration. I think what he does is great. So I'm not trying to, some people were accusing me of being too negative on this, but I think that, he's a guy that, is he UFC caliber? Meaning, could he be in the UFC? Is he good enough to be in the UFC? Yes. With that being said, do I think it's that he should be in the UFC? No, I don't think anybody should be in the UFC. I think it's kind of up to, if you're going by the standard, there'd be thousands of fighters that should be in the UFC. If you took the bottom guy in each division and said, hey, if you meet this threshold, you're good enough to be in the UFC. There are guys that we don't even know about that are in that level, like Alex Munoz, So for me, I'm still saying that, like Nick Newell, is his talent level good enough to be in the UFC? Yes. Even after the loss. So that's something I just think is important for people when they look at prospects and things, just kind of realize that, or just about the UFC in general and their signings, like they're especially overseas, everywhere. There are a lot of good fighters in the world, and to kind of single him out as being, I feel like people almost held him to too high expectations, like he was somebody that was being, that for him to be on the Contender Series was like a step down from what he was used to or what he was deserving. So I hope I don't know what Nick will do from here. I don't know if you have any thoughts about that or what the future holds, but he retired already once. I'm not sure if he's gonna go back to that or if he's gonna keep pursuing or what.
Yeah, I do have some thoughts. I mean, I echo kind of what you said about him. The fact that when people were saying that it's a travesty that he's not in the UFC and that basically he should already be there and that he shouldn't even have to be on the Contender Series, I kind of laughed at that because, I mean, if you do a little bit of research, the guys that he was fighting outside of Justin Gaethje, and I feel like we've talked about people's opponents a lot on this show, but it's just true, man. Like outside of Justin Gaethje, like there was some real stinkers in there, and like we just really didn't know what Nick was capable of, and now we know. I feel for the guy. I feel like the UFC did everything they could. They, like you said, the guy they matched him up with had been out for nearly 2 years. Wasn't someone who was known as a big power puncher or anything. Had only had 4 pro fights. So I mean, this was not a matchup where they were trying to keep Nick out of the UFC. That's a ridiculous notion. And I Justin Sumter, who I've talked to before, trains with him, is a great guy. I'm sure he's
today actually.
Yeah, I'm sure he's really. I'm really bummed out. I know the whole team's probably bummed out, man. But I mean, that's what the Contender Series is here for, though. It's to, and I said this many times. It's to see who's for real and like who's who's not there yet, basically. And I think Nick, can take this as a learning experience. Definitely go back to the drawing board, look at some of the weaknesses he has, maybe prepare for this kind of more wrestling-based attack that he might face. Munoz definitely came in with the intent to win this fight. He didn't come in with the intent to score some highlight reel knockout. That's not the kind of fighter he is. Clearly, he's a wrestling-based fighter, and he was stuck to that. Credit to him for that. He didn't try to change up his game plan, didn't hold back. And it's also worth noting, as I bring up Nick's opponents, that it's hard for him to find fights.
Yep.
It's really hard for him to find. So it's hard to fault him for not fighting guys, for fighting guys that aren't probably at his level, because it's hard to find guys that are willing to fight him, because the risk reward thing, it's just really messed up. Like if you win, you're beating up a guy, that's seen as having a disability. And then if you lose, it's like, oh, you're the guy who got beat by the guy with only one hand, you must suck.
Yeah. I would have liked to hear a pre-fight interview from Munoz about, I tried to set one up and then it didn't work out. It was kind of last second, but I would have liked to hear from him about his thoughts going into a situation like that, because it must be super friggin' awkward. Like, we had like 3 months of buildup where we knew Nick Newell was fighting on the show, and everybody, all the fans and national outlets picking this up about this inspirational story. And then you have to be the guy that goes out there, not only tries to beat him in some type of competition, but actually try to punch him in the face and use any type of openings that his disability were to have or open up to your advantage. Like, it's just kind of I know it's fighting and people realize that, and it's part of the sport, but it must on some level be a little bit weird.
Like, if this was a movie, right, Munoz would be like the bad guy. He'd be
yeah, exactly,
rooting against him. He'd be like, that guy,
like saying inappropriate stuff. And
yeah, like, what a bully. Like man, like he ruined this guy's dreams or whatever. Like, screw him. We all hate him. But no, he's just another fighter, that went out there and did his job, and it happened to be his night.
Yeah.
His game plan was perfect. He's coming from an excellent camp in Team Alpha Male, so he has that in his corner. And he knew. I think he probably did a lot. There's a lot of tape out there on Nick. Is another thing. There's a lot of tape on Nick.
True.
So he clearly game planned for him, and he did, and executed that to a T.
Yeah. Couldn't agree more, man. And, that brought us to our decision by Dana White. And I think we kind of pretty much already touched on them just with the way things flowed. But I think Dana got things right this week again. I think UFC, from what I've heard, is clearly allotted more spaces for roster additions from the Contender Series than they did last year. Both with
an expansion, baby.
Yeah, I don't know, because what I've been told by a couple fighters who were in talks with the UFC around like early spring was that the UFC kind of indicated to them that once the Contender Series was a couple months away, like May or late April, May would be when they kind of almost cut off North American prospects from being signed. Like, that was not something that occurred last year. They were signing these guys kind of sparingly. There'd be 1 or 2 guys an episode. There was one episode where there was 3, and now every week it's like 4 get a contract, and 3 get a contract, and 2 get a contract, and 3 get a contract. So they're definitely allotting more spaces. And then even on top of that, we started to see some guys today on the broadcast get signed to short notice replacements from the first episode.
Yeah, that was interesting. We'll definitely get into that. But as far as just to cover all our bases right now, Jim Crute, Sadiq Yusuf, Jeff Hughes all got UFC contracts, and then Chase Hooper, as I predicted, got the developmental deal, which is perfect for him. He's 18, clearly very green. Could use some fights in LFA, another Contender Series fight, whatever have you. Definitely could use that. Only fighter not to get a contract, as we probably knew, was Munoz. And
he's got to be still on their radar, though. I'm sure.
Still on their radar for sure. And like you said, we had during the broadcast Lauren Senko apparently thinking she was Nolan King, breaking all these news stories. Man, first one that popped up was the Montel Jackson is stepping in to fight Ricky Simon at UFC 227 because Benito Lopez is injured. What do you think about that matchup? Good, bad? Obviously, late notice.
Yeah. So for me, it's kind of a weird one. I have a couple levels to my thoughts. One is I'm kind of bummed that the original fight between Lopez and Simon didn't turn out to come to fruition.
Which was supposed to be on the main. They actually had just announced that was going to be on the pay-per-view portion.
Yeah, the opening bout, I think, and I honestly was super stoked for that fight. I think both guys are really exciting. They didn't like each other either. They were going back and forth on Twitter, so little disappointed. Pulled. At the same time, Montel Jackson is a guy that I think has a lot of potential. I would have liked to see him get one more fight. Like, again, in an ideal world where prospects don't get rushed, I wouldn't have mind him getting one more fight in before taking a fight like Ricky Simon. Like, this is no, there's a big step up. No offense to Rico Desculo. That guy's awesome. He's been quite a talent here in New England, but there's a big step in between. They could have found some middle ground for Jackson's progress in a perfect world where, he wasn't going from Rico Desculo to Ricky Simone. But we're not in a perfect world, and that's the way things work, and you got to seize opportunities when they come up. Interesting little fact that probably doesn't really even matter, but Simone and Montel Jackson are both managed by Iridium Sports, and I was talking to setting up some interviews today, and I was told that this is only the third time in the history of Iridium that they've allowed or set up a fight between two of their own fighters. Which, if you know how many fighters they've had they have hundreds of fighters over the span of like the last 3 years. So, it's pretty. They think highly of both of them, and I think that it's going to be a good fight. I would say Simone should be favored, but I'll watch it and I'll probably enjoy it. They could have gone with a lot worse, believe me.
Yeah, that's a fun little fact there. I like that. If you're talking about a lot worse, this next one that they announced, I thought fit that description, as Kevin Holland is apparently going to face the always scary Thiago Santos. No big deal. The guy just knocks out everybody and is built like a human tank. No big deal for Kevin Holland in his UFC debut, as he was rather uninspiring in his Contender Series bout. He tried to showboat a lot. Really, honestly, I didn't leave the fight incredibly impressed. I could see flashes of his talent and whatnot, but this is rough matchmaking, in my opinion. I don't know what you think.
Yeah, I think it's a bit of a scramble, just with UFC 227 seemingly on the verge of shambles in some ways. I shouldn't say that. It's still a decent card, decent pay-per-view, but it's not.
You can say it.
Okay, I said it. Gustafsson, Volkan falling off. UFC, I think, felt obliged, especially with Jackson replacing Lopez. That was supposed to be a main card fight, so I think the UFC felt obliged to at least, throw the fans in LA a bone with this fight. Just seems very last minute thrown together, just like they didn't have many options. Thiago Santos, like you said, super scary dude. Like, you had a lineup of MMA fighters that just on looks alone and there's presence that I wouldn't want to fight, he would be one of them. This is just a weird matchup, especially with the performance that Holland had. I mean, I've seen what he's capable of outside of the Contender Series, but if that was my first time that I had seen him, I would have been like, man, this dude's on the bottom of my list as far as the winners go to get a contract from Dana White. I mean, he was showboating a guy that he was 11-1 favorite against, and he was getting hit for it. He got taken down and lost a round at the end of the fight because of it. It was just kind of like you said, I think uninspiring is a perfect word. I think it was a little disappointing. He even said it. He was like, yeah, that wasn't, a contract worthy performance. So it's a little weird. It makes me, again, think that they're even going to go to sign more of these guys than we were even used to last year. The after the fact pack, the guys that weren't signed on the show, but then take short notice replacements or get a fight afterwards. I think we're going to see a lot of that this season if this is the pace we're going at, where we're just touching on week one now.
I can't think of another one that was this lopsided. I mean, we're talking about in Thiago Santos, we're talking about a guy who is just coming off, who just had a streak of 4 straight knockouts ended by David Branch, who's a top-class talent in the division. It's no slight at all to lose to him. People saw what Anthony Smith did to Shogun over the weekend. Thiago Santos took him out in the second round,
fairly dominantly as well.
Yeah, I mean, this is a scary ass dude, and if you're Kevin Holland and you try to showboat versus him, I think your life might end.
Yeah, literally. That's what I was thinking. It's one thing. Will Santiago's got hard hands, but when you got a reach like Santos that can extend past your chin and just, man, I think that this could end, fairly brutally. Hopefully we see the Kevin Holland that we thought we were going to see, because that Kevin Holland, I think, was a guy that I thought was poised to be a top 15 fighter at some point. But regardless, I'm not a huge fan of this matchmaking. I feel like I'm not, obviously I'm not Mick Maynard. I'm not Sean Shelby. I don't know what the options were. I appreciate them trying to add stuff to a card that's destroyed. Oftentimes they just kind of, say whatever, we already sold tickets. So I guess it's good they're giving the fans that bought tickets something, but at the same time, clearly not an ideal matchup here.
All right, so that pretty much wraps up this week. Did you want to give us a quick little preview of next week before you
do like a 2-minute rundown? If there's anything you want to to throw out there about any of these guys, just yell out. But yeah, I think I said this last week. I feel like every week for the last 3 weeks, things get better in terms of talent. I think these next 2 weeks are going to be absolutely incredible, both in action and in the level of fights that we see. Looking over next week's card, we have a couple of heavyweight fights. We have a lightweight fight, a featherweight fight, and a middleweight fight. So all over the board here. Kicking off the card, we have Juan Adams, LFA veteran, very interesting character, very not a guy that's not afraid to tell you what's on his mind. He's got a little bit of a character. He's great. Against Sean Teed, a really solid stay-at-home, classic heavyweight with some power, some wrestling abilities, very well-rounded. I think this is going to be a good matchup, especially where Adams is, I think, one of the more highly touted prospects in the heavyweight division in the United States, but he's not necessarily as proven as some other guys. He's only 3 fights into his pro career, so I think that's a great fight to kick it off. And I think Sean Teed, I'll have to just make sure that I'm not wrong. Sometimes I get the New Jersey promotions mixed up, but I believe he's a CFFC fighter. He's a guy that, I think he's been training with Justin Sumter, who's also on this card, has been down training with him. And he's only 26 years old, trains out of Ricardo Almeida Jiu-Jitsu. So got a good camp around him, and I think that's going to be a great fight, as are the next 4 fights. Next one, Maurice Mitchell versus Jordan Griffin. Maurice Mitchell's from Alaska FC. They have 2 representatives on this season. Mitchell is their 145-pound representative. He's going
like probably at least if we're talking about Alaskan fighting. I mean, this is the draw, the guy. That everybody. If you're gonna watch an Alaskan fighting card, it should be with him on it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And, there was his brother also fights for them too. They're both kind of draws. His brother was the one that was on The Ultimate Fighter when they did the flyweight season with all the champions. He was on that. I think I don't remember who's older. Terrence Mitchell and Maurice Mitchell are the 2 brothers. Maurice Mitchell is usually a bantamweight, and he's moving up for this fight to featherweight. Which will be interesting because Jordan Griffin's no joke. He's one of these guys that started off his career at like 1-3, and now he's sitting at 16-5. And I think his only 2 losses, like in the last 5 years or so, have been to Dan Moret, who's in the UFC now, and then Bilal Muhammad, Juan Archuleta was the other one. So 2 really good fighters there. Were his only 2 losses since 2013 or 2012. So no joke here. He's got a 2-0 record in LFA. Just last fought at LFA 41 back in June, won via first-round rear naked choke. So that's a good fight. Griffin clearly has a little bit of an advantage in the resume, but that doesn't always mean that he's a better fighter. But I think that's going to be a really exciting fight. And it leads us to our middleweight fight, which I think one of the most highly touted prospects on the entire season is in this one. Ian Heinisch, a guy that is the LFA interim middleweight champion. A lot of people believe he's the best middleweight prospect in the United States. And I think it'll be interesting to see him take on Justin Sumter, a guy that we referenced earlier, training partner Nick Newell. He's been fighting here in New England. He's also been viewing options otherwhere. He went down and fought for 864 fighting championships down in the Carolinas.
I interviewed him before that fight, by the way.
Yes, you did. You certainly did.
Yeah, he's a very cool dude. I thought his story was interesting because he had such like an extensive amateur career, and he had fought Eric Anders actually in his amateur days.
Yeah.
And lost to him. But I asked him why he had so many amateur, because he had quite a few, and it was just like he wanted to like experience all the things that a pro would have to without actually, having kind of, I wouldn't say the real consequences, but just before getting there, knowing what that was going to feel like. And then, he also said it was very hard to find fights for him, in the New England area. And, the guy he just fought, Roger Carroll, has, the list of names he fought was pretty extensive. From Bellator, CES, and all that. So definitely a veteran that he got a win over recently. And then the last thing on him was that I thought was interesting was the first fight he ever took was quite the mismatch. It was in his UFC MMA pro debut was versus Tim
Karen.
Yeah, who's just like, if you know anything about MMA, it's like why, just a big mismatch basically.
Right. Yeah. I mean, at the time, like I was in the building that night, and Karen was thought of as being the next big thing out of Massachusetts and everything, or New England, and Sumter was making his pro debut, and Sumter beat him up pretty badly, and almost got caught in a submission at the end, and ended up getting choked out. But it was a good showing, and I think he's been continued that trajectory. Obviously, he's undefeated since that time that he lost his pro debut, six wins in a row, and he'll be taking on a big challenge here. He's a guy that loves challenges. I mean, I talked to him earlier today doing an interview for the upcoming fight, and he told me he was offered the main event slot on week 1 against Alonzo Menafield, but he turned it down because he didn't want to move up to 205. So, he's willing to do what's best for him, even if it means sacrificing, a UFC opportunity even. And then they ended up calling him back. So everything worked out. But he's a talented guy. His mind's in the right place, and he's got a really tough opponent in front of him here. So I think it will make for a good clash, which leads to our co-main event, which I'm super psyched about. We got Don'Tale Mayes, who I think might just be the best heavyweight prospect in the United States, against Mitchell Sipe or Sipe. I'm not sure how to pronounce that yet. I've watched tape on him. I usually listen to music when I watch tape, so I didn't listen to the announcing. I'll have to get the correct pronunciation on that for next week. But that's a good fight. Mayes is a guy that's very agile for a heavyweight. He throws weird, weird combinations, weird angles, kicks, spinning things. And he was a guy who was on Contender Series last year, and he kind of choked a little bit. He was thought of, again, as being a super highly touted heavyweight, went in there, was grinded out by Alan Crowder in kind of not the prettiest fight, but a really impressive performance on Crowder's behalf. So I think this will be good. Stipe's sitting at 4-0, and he's another young guy. They could clearly use some youth in the heavyweight division now that they're starting to build their talent back. We're finally getting some heavyweights. Super stoked for that. Leads us up to our main event between Garrett Gross and Roosevelt Roberts.
One thought on God.
No, go for it.
I don't know what is Sipe, I guess.
Sipe, I think.
We're just gonna roll with that. Fought Tex Pellis. So I should know more about him, but I don't. The one thing I do know is he's not one of these heavyweights that like we saw tonight. He's built. He's very built.
Yeah.
So don't expect him to look like the two heavyweights who fought tonight.
Right.
Ben Rothwell kind of status.
Yeah. Both these guys. I mean, I think Sipe. I hope we're pronouncing his name right. I think it's Sipe.
Okay, so if his nickname is No Dice, Sipe. Mitchell Sipe.
It's gonna be Sipe.
No Dice Sipe.
Yep, you're right.
Fixed it. Boom.
Yep. But he's only 22, and he's a little he's 6'2", 245 pounds, so pretty compact guy. Mayes is 6'6", 265. So he's a big boy. I think he has to cut to get down, to my understanding. I think he walks around 290 is what somebody told me. And he can, like I said, he can do spinning back kicks, all types of stuff. So definitely a name to watch there. And then the main event, the Battle of the Alliteration. We have Garrett Gross versus Roosevelt Roberts. Garrett Gross, Shamrock FC fighter, another guy that started off his career kind of poorly in terms of his record. He's on a 4-fight win streak now that's propelled him to be one of the more promoted fighters for Shamrock, earning him this opportunity. He told me, I talked to him today too. I was banging out all the interviews for next week. He told me that he was every single lightweight fight that fell out or somebody got hurt for months. He's been emailing Sean Shelby. He said he remembers sitting there typing that he wanted to fight Khabib when Max Holloway pulled out. He said he didn't care if it was championships or whatever. He wanted to drill his name in Sean Shelby's head, and apparently it worked. He's fighting a tough guy in front of him, a little bit of a relative unknown in Roosevelt Roberts. I believe he goes by Roe Roberts, R-O-W. I had a really tough time finding him on social media, and then I ended up finding him under that name. So I think this is a good matchup again, and I'm excited about next week.
I saw Roberts live at the
Bellator?
The Rampage Fedor card.
Yeah. How do you look? Do you remember?
I remember him obliterating his opponent.
Yeah.
Like just totally obliterating him.
Yeah, I wonder. Again, I have to go, and I only started watching tape for the interviews that I did today. So he's a guy that I'm reaching out to tonight in the second batch of interviews. So we'll see what's up with him, and I'm super excited though, man. I think, like I said, these next 2 weeks are awesome. The week that's the August 7th week, I think is going to be a grand finale. I love that card, and we'll talk about that next week. We'll talk about week 7 recap next week. You have anything else you wanna plug or anything?
Just stay tuned to MMA Today. Like I tweeted out all the interviews that Nolan did, the breakdown that Sean did. I really don't think anybody covers Contender Series quite like we do. So definitely, if you like Contender Series, you like this, this podcast we've been doing, give us a like, follow us on, followers. You subscribe on YouTube. Subscribe on YouTube.
Man, we're getting into the YouTube game. We got to get used to this vernacular.
I don't even follow us on Twitter at MMA Today News. Same thing on Facebook. I'm Big Tone MMA on Twitter, and Nolan actually is Kings on Twitter.
I gotta change that just for you.
Are you really?
Yeah, just for you.
MMA King? It doesn't have the same kind of ring to it. I don't know.
But yeah, that's pretty much, I think, all we've got. You can follow me, like I said, at MMA_Kings, or like Tone said, I should say. And then we also have a bunch of interviews coming out for the card next week, the one that follows, some scattered interviews throughout with Bellator, UFC, PFL. We've got it covered. You can also catch my work on Flow Combat Tapology. And that's pretty much it, man. I just stole the show from you, so I'm going to sign us off. Until next time.
Oh, do you have that power? Holy shit.
Yeah, man. I do. But until next time, guys, I appreciate your time, and thanks for joining us, and we'll talk to you. I don't actually have that power. You have to sign us off.
Oh, okay. I thought you were